Okay, so continuing on with chapter 6, now you're going to notice that there is going to be a homework assigned to you, and I think it showed up today, called membrane transport homework. And the reason I had to put a separate mastering homework in to cover that topic is because this information is actually covered in chapter 4, but we're covering it in this PowerPoint. Okay, so this is the lecture to watch to get the information to help you with the membrane transport mastering homework. Okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about the concept of osmotic pressure, and especially as it relates to your patients and you know, the patients either you have now or that you'll have in the future. You may have already covered this topic if you've taken any intro to nursing courses, but we're going to go a little more in depth because some of these processes are also going to be important in how we control bacterial populations and kill pathogens. Okay, but let's start out very basic. So osmotic pressure, the big wordy definition is the pressure exerted by the flow of water through a semi-permeable membrane, which means some stuff gets through and some stuff doesn't. Usually bigger stuff doesn't get through. And this semi-permeable membrane separates two solutions with different concentrations of solute. So the first thing to know is whenever you hear the term solute, what I'm talking about is kind of stuff that is inside or outside a cell. And normally it's bigger stuff, okay? So solutes can include salts, sugars, you know, like glucose, fructose, proteins, you know, any type of protein like an enzyme, anything that is basically can be solid inside or outside a cell. In the case of salts, it can also be, because those are ionic compounds, in the form of ions, you know, so like calcium ions, potassium ions. The other thing to remember is that all cell membranes are semi-permeable membranes. So normally little things go back and forth however they want, like oxygen and water and really small things. But when you talk about bigger molecules like, you know, glucose, amino acids, proteins, nucleic acids, those types of things, those are too big to be able to just kind of diffuse and cross the membrane by themselves. Okay, so when we talk about specifically osmotic pressure, we're talking about the different concentrations of stuff, and then because of that, it causes the flow of water to be different, whether it's into the cell or out of the cell. So that's what we're talking about. So when we talk about different mechanisms for nutrient absorption or how nutrients get into the cell, so obviously cells, you know, they have to take in nutrition and then they have to transport their waste products out or they would become toxic and die. And this goes for bacteria, it goes for your cells, plant cells, whatever, okay? Because remember, we all have cell membranes. So these transport mechanisms always occur across the cell membrane, even when you have organisms with cell walls like plants and most bacteria. So this is a reason, first of all, why cells have to be really, really small because, you know, especially in bacteria, there's no mechanism to pump things in and out. You have to have it just kind of be taken in and then have it slowly diffuse around the cytoplasm and reach wherever it has to go. So if cells were really big, the toxic waste would kind of hang out in the middle of the cell and kill the cell, and the nutrients would kind of hang out by the cell membrane, and you know, they wouldn't get to where they needed to go. So that's a reason why cells have to be so dinky to be able to survive. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this movie. I'm kind of a fan of old-timey science fiction. So this movie came out in, I think, the late 70s, because I remember watching it as a child and being absolutely terrified. But when you watch it now, it is literally the dumbest movie you've ever seen. Okay, so the blob shown here was like, it was basically a big cell, okay, but it looked kind of, you know, blood red to make it scary. And the blob would surround people and basically dissolve them and eat them, okay? So when I look back at it now, it makes me laugh because literally the blob moved at a speed of like 0.00001 miles per hour. So you could literally outwalk the blob. I don't know why people were so terrified, but all these doctors and scientists tried to figure out how to kill the blob and they couldn't figure it out. Guess who the hero of the story was? Of course, the nurse, as is really common in everyday life. And she figured out, I'm just gonna pour a bunch of salt on it. It's gonna screw up the osmotic pressure and the blob will die, okay? It's basically like the same thing that people use to kill, you know, slugs in their garden. So anytime you put a whole bunch of stuff, in this case salt, outside the cell, that's gonna screw up the osmotic relationships and it's gonna cause that cell to die, okay? And that's what we're gonna be talking about. But yeah, if you're in the mood to watch a really, you know, dumb, kitschy movie, yeah, watch The Blob. It's probably on YouTube. Okay, so first of all, let's define diffusion. So the definition of diffusion is the movement of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration until everything is equal. Okay, so think of, for example, if someone opens up a bottle of perfume in one corner of the room, okay, it's gonna start, those molecules are gonna come out of the bottle. People closest to the bottle are gonna smell them first, and then eventually people way on the other side of the room are gonna smell that perfume. And it's because the perfume molecules are gonna disperse or diffuse within that room from a high concentration in the bottle to a lower concentration, which means working their way across the room until everything is equal. So a couple of things too that I want you to understand. So diffusion just happens naturally. You don't have to do anything to get it to happen, okay? So because that happens, we refer to diffusion as a passive process, meaning that you don't have to put any energy into it. You don't have to add any ATP or whatever. It's just gonna happen spontaneously, okay? If any of you have taken chemistry recently, I'm sure you've talked about entropy, okay? And that things tend to, you know, go towards chaos or disorder. This is like one of those processes, okay? It obeys entropy. So whenever I say something is a passive process, it means that it's just gonna happen. And diffusion is one of those processes. Okay, the other thing is that diffusion is said to move with a concentration gradient. Okay, so a concentration gradient, and I'm gonna try to do some notes over here. Oh, here's my snack. So if you have a whole bunch of molecules here, my corgis are fighting. Hey, pipe down. Okay, and you have just a few molecules here, the fact that diffusion is going to go from high to low, okay, you'll notice it's uneven, right? This is what we refer to as a concentration gradient. Okay, so going with the concentration gradient means that molecules will go from high to low until they're equal. And once again, this is a passive process that requires no energy. Later, I'm gonna talk about going against a concentration gradient. That would be when you're trying to move molecules from a low concentration back towards a high concentration. And this absolutely requires energy because this isn't naturally going to happen, okay? Going from high to low is going to naturally happen. Okay, so that's what we mean by going with a concentration gradient. So when you go through your reading, You may also see the terms, passive diffusion, simple diffusion. It all means the same thing. It's basically diffusion. So any molecule that's going from a high concentration to a low concentration until it's equal, that is diffusion. So here's another example, and I don't even know if people use sugar cubes anymore, but let's say you have your morning coffee and you have a sugar cube. Now you can let it sit in the coffee and eventually it's going to slowly dissolve, but what's happening right here, it's dissolving, and then the molecules are eventually going to equally diffuse around your cup of coffee, and it'll be nice and sweet. Okay, so when we talk about the diffusion of specifically water and water only, that is the term osmosis. Okay, so osmosis is defined as the diffusion of water through a selectively or a semi-permeable membrane. Selectively basically means the same thing. It means the bigger stuff can't go through the membrane, but water, being nice and small, can. Okay, so every cell membrane is selectively permeable, and that water can freely diffuse throughout the membrane. Okay, but other things are going to be blocked. Okay, but the water will react to different concentrations of solute on either side of that membrane. Okay, so think of basically solute, things like, amino acids, proteins, simple sugars inside a cell versus outside a cell. And whatever the difference is, water is going to move to whatever concentration it needs to try to correct the fact that the concentrations are different. So that's what we refer to as osmosis. And the extent to which this happens, that's what osmotic pressure is. Okay, so here's an example. All right, so let's look at this first. Okay, let's look at this guy. Okay, so here we have a beaker of stuff, and this is our semi-permeable membrane. The red circles represent solute, okay? So they're too big to pass through the membrane by themselves. And, they could be anything like glucose or amino acids, whatever, but they're too big. The little blue circles represent water molecules, okay? Now notice, okay, you have way more of the red circles on this side than you do over here. Okay, another way of thinking about that is because of that, you have way more water over here than you do here. Okay, so water is going to move towards where the solute concentration is the highest to try to reduce the concentration of the solute and to make the net concentrations equal. So what will happen is you'll actually see the water level rise because water is trying to dilute where the higher solute is and make it equal. Okay, another way you can look at it is that water is going to go diffuse from a higher concentration to a lower concentration until it's equal. Okay, and I'm going to show you examples of these. Okay, so let me get that back. Okay, so I'm going to stop and get this uploaded, and I'm going to put my dogs outside because they keep barking and they're really irritating. So I'm going to pick up with this in just a minute. Okay, thank you.